Good afternoon. We are going to go ahead and begin this afternoon's keynote. It is the start of the hour, and half past the hour rather, and we want to make sure that we are providing a forum whereby our students, faculty, staff, and community can begin to engage in a dialogue with our keynote speaker and selected One Book, One University author, Dr. Viet Nguyen. I'm going to frame some context, and then I will have a student introduce our speaker. For most of you who know me at events like this, it's really important for me to have students connect with the visitors who come to our campus. I think that that's one of the most empowering things that we can do as faculty and as staff on the campus. But I do want to provide some open context with respect to Lyceum at Verne, One Book, One University, and the Visual and Performing Arts and Lecture Series. And One Book, One University grew out of a desire to have our students share in a common experience. And that common experience has grown over the years with the leadership of our writing program faculty, as well as faculty who are teaching in our first-year learning experience known as the Flex. And we were very fortunate earlier today to have Dr. Nguyen with a captive audience of about 450 first-year students in the Sports, Science, and Athletic Pavilion. And thank you. They were able to engage him in a way that was meaningful, intentional, and deliberate. And so I'd like to say this afternoon that we would like to continue that conversation even post the formal lecture with respect to Dr. Nguyen and the Refugees. A bit about the Refugees. The Refugees is a collection of 8 short stories, all centering around the experiences of refugees from the Vietnam War and their descendants. The stories, written over a period of 20 years, are narrated in both first and third person and examine the Vietnamese experience in America, as well as questions of home, family, and identity. Dr. Nguyen's story and struggle of cultural duality is not unique among Vietnamese Americans. Generation after generation of immigrants, refugees, and social newcomers to American society face these challenges. However, in doing some research very recently, Dr. Nguyen made a quote that I thought was very pertinent to the selection that we've identified this year, the refugees, and contextualizing it with respect to common modern day. Quote, "I wanted to write stories that would contest the American stories of the Vietnam War. We as Vietnamese refugees are people considered to those in Vietnam as traitors, losers, dissidents. It's a struggle to make our presence and our memory heard and felt," end quote. This afternoon, we have a first-year student who will be taking the mic to introduce Dr. Nguyen before his presentation. I have the privilege of introducing Tammy Wong, who is a ULV first-year student. She is a chemistry major who hopes to go on to pharmacy school and travel to underdeveloped countries to provide medicine, education, and opportunity to those in need. She is a Vietnamese Chinese American who is the child of a Vietnamese immigrant and a Chinese Vietnam-born immigrant. She draws much of her identity from being Vietnamese and hopes to share her experience of being a child of a Vietnamese immigrant. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our first-year student, Tammy Wong.
Oh, hello, I'm Tammy Wong. When I interviewed my mother, Thuy Wong, for my class profile essay, I had no idea what she would tell me. Therefore, when she said the new communist government threw anyone they could from the old government into jail, and how everyone felt scared while living in Vietnam, I was surprised and astonished since I knew nothing about it while living in America. Growing up as the child of a Vietnamese immigrant in America is interesting. I noticed how the Vietnam War was often mainly told on the side of Americans, and how history class rarely acknowledged how the Vietnamese people felt about losing their home. I understood that thousands of Americans lost their lives in the war, but over 2 million Vietnamese citizens perished and thousands more were left with nothing. Additionally, the sacrifice of Americans in a foreign war seemed to create animosity towards Vietnamese immigrants as well as refugees, pushing the blame onto those who had no voice in a political war. These are only some of the reasons why the stories of Vietnamese immigrants and refugees need to be told. A Vietnamese migration story is oftentimes overlooked or assumed, but a published series of short stories telling the difficult, confusing beginnings of refugees can open up the doors to see through the eyes of one. These short stories, written by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the author of the novel The Sympathizer, was the winner of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. He is also the author of the cultural history Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, which is a finalist in a nonfiction for the 2017 National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as the winner of the Rene Wilkes Prize. His current book is the short story collection, The Refugees. He is also the Earl Arnold Chair of English and the professor of the American Studies and Ethnicity at University of Southern California. I am honored to introduce Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and to Dean Potter for those introductions. Hello, University of La Verne. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I just want to do this first if I can. Okay. Yeah. I can't help it, I'm Asian. It was interesting talking to Tammy before getting up here because I learned two things about her. One is that she's studying to be a pharmacist, and the other is that she wants to be a hip-hop dancer. And I really encourage her in the latter pursuit. We need more Vietnamese hip-hop dancers. And the reason why I find that so interesting is because oftentimes I'm asked, what do the newer generation of Vietnamese Americans care about? Because my generation of Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese refugees, it's assumed that we care about the war that brought us here. And that's the issue that we're concerned with, that we care about. And sometimes when we care about something so strongly, we have no idea what other people care about. So even though we're both Vietnamese, we're separated, well, not too many years, but a certain number of years. And I think I have a hard time knowing what Tammy's generation cares about. And that's actually the title of the lecture today, or the presentation more like, why should we care? If you're reading the headlines today or you're watching the news, there's so many things that are happening today that give us a challenge to care about them or not to care about them. Black Lives Matter, undocumented people, DACA, those are college students who are the dreamers whose parents have been undocumented, the hurricane in Puerto Rico, NFL players taking a knee, trans people asking for their rights and identities, the plight of the white working class that supposedly has determined our most recent presidential election. And I think each of those events poses a challenge because they implicitly ask us, why should we care about anybody who is different than we are? Because with that whole list of events and peoples and populations that I mentioned, for most of us, we don't have a direct connection to those experiences and to those peoples. And that's true for refugees as well. And I'm a refugee. And of course, I care about refugees. Now, in Europe and the United States, in the last year or two, the issue of refugees has really been at the forefront of political conversations. There have been influxes of refugees across Europe and into the United States as well, or rather, there have been requests for refugees to come into the United States that the United States has mostly declined. And it's a crucial humanitarian issue, but it's also an issue that raises political, economic, and cultural questions about who we are as a country or who Europe is as a civilization, whether we should welcome people from different places, different cultures, and different religions into our society and what our society even is. And of course, the issue of refugees is very personal for me because I'm a refugee as well. And what my experience as a refugee has taught me is not simply to care about refugees, but to care about others as well. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. How do we go from a position of caring about people who are just like us, people whose experiences we share, to caring about others who are not like us at all, at least on the surface? So I wanted to start by sharing my personal experience of being a refugee with you, because when we hear the word refugees, I think oftentimes we think that these people are so remote from us, they're possibly not even human like us. And yet my own experience has been that refugees are very human indeed. Now, my parents were born in North Vietnam in the 1930s when the country was still under French colonization. And then there was a terrible war that was fought to liberate the country from the French. And the result of that was that the country was divided in two in 1954 when the French were defeated. And my parents were living in the North as the country was divided. And my parents, along with a million other North Vietnamese Catholics, became refugees. They were afraid of communists, so they fled from the North to the South. And they moved to a small town in the Central Highlands called Ban Ma Thuột. And this small town has two distinctions. One is that it's famous for making coffee. So if you drink U-Ban, for example, you've probably got Vietnamese coffee beans in your U-Ban. And it's famous or infamous for being the first town captured in the final invasion of the Vietnam War in March 1975. And at that time, my father was in Saigon on business, leaving my mother, my 10-year-old brother, myself, and my 16-year-old adopted sister at home in Ban Ma Thuột. And when the Communist Army seized our town, all lines of communication were cut off. So my mother had to make a life and death decision about what to do. What she decided was to flee with my 10-year-old brother and my 4-year-old self and leave my 16-year-old adopted sister behind to take care of the family property. Because she believed reasonably that the war would continue, that it would go back and forth as it had done in the past. And she was wrong. So she and my father would not see their adopted daughter again for 20 years, would not see my mother's family for 20 years, and would not see my father's family, who was in the North, for 40 years after 1954 before they were able to return in the early 1990s. But one night in March 1975, my mother decided to flee this city with my brother and myself and walk to the nearest port town of Nha Trang, which is about 150 miles away. Fortunately, it was all downhill. And fortunately, at 4 years of age, I remembered nothing about this experience. I count myself lucky, because my brother, who was 10 years old, would remember how awful that experience was, of a highway and of roads that were clogged with tens of thousands of fleeing civilians and fleeing soldiers, of dead paratroopers hanging from the trees, as he would write about later. But we made it to Nha Trang. We found ourselves on a boat. We made it to Saigon. We were lucky to reunite with my father. And a month later, in April 1975, we repeated the entire experience again when the Communist Army reached Saigon as well. And if you've seen pictures of helicopters fleeing from Saigon with civilians clamoring to get on board, we were among those civilians who were not on board those helicopters. We were among those civilians who were outside the American embassy trying to get in. We were among those civilians outside the airport trying to get in. And finally, we were very lucky. We got onto a barge at the docks. I still don't know how. My father got onto one barge. My brother, my mother, and myself got onto another, and we all managed to escape. And fortunately, we were reunited later on another boat. So we got away. We made it to the United States a month or so later to one of 4 refugee camps that were set up to process the 150,000 Vietnamese refugees who had been lucky enough to flee. And our camp was in Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And this is where my memories really begin. And some of my first memories were actually of being taken away from my parents at 4 years of age and being sent to live with an American white sponsor family. Because in order to leave one of these refugee camps as a Vietnamese refugee, you had to have an American sponsor. In our case, My parents were sent to one family, my 10-year-old brother was sent to another, and my 4-year-old self was sent to a third. And so my memories begin with the trauma of being a refugee and of being taken away from my parents. Fortunately, it was only for a summer. My brother, who was 10 years old, didn't come home for 2 years. And he said, well, it's because Mom loved you more. And she couldn't stand having you taken away from her. But don't feel sorry for him, because about 7 years later, he went to Harvard, so he was fine. It was good for him. We spent a few years in India, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, before my parents realized it was too cold and the job opportunities were not good. And they got a call from a friend in San Jose, California, who said, come over here. Weather's warmer, there's better economic resources. And so my parents moved to San Jose in 1978, and they opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in the city, the first one being opened by their friend. And I remember walking down the street, East Santa Clara Street in San Jose, in downtown San Jose, at a time in the 1970s and 1980s when San Jose had not yet been made over by Silicon Valley. Downtown San Jose was a place where no one wanted to be except for the Vietnamese refugees who found economic opportunity there. And I remember, even at that age, 10 years old perhaps, a sign in a store window. And what it said was, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. And I didn't understand what that sign meant. I mean, I knew literally what it meant, that people like us were not wanted here. But there was a larger story underneath it, and I wasn't aware of what that story was. And then not long after that, I watched a movie on something called a VCR. Some of you may not know what that is, but it's a machine that plays a video cassette, which is how we used to have to watch movies and listen to music on cassettes. And this movie was Apocalypse Now. I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, but it's a very famous movie. Anywhere I go in the world, people have seen Apocalypse Now. It's an American movie about the Vietnam War, and through the 1970s and 1980s, America was fighting its Vietnam War again on celluloid. That's also something you don't know about. We didn't have digital back then, but people used to watch movies in movie theaters, and Apocalypse Now was one of these movies. And I thought of myself not just as a Vietnamese refugee, but as an American boy. And as I was watching that movie, I identified with the American soldiers just as I identified with the American soldiers in John Wayne movies as they fought the Japanese. But something very interesting happened. At a certain moment in Apocalypse Now, the American soldiers kill Vietnamese people. And I felt myself split in two, because I wasn't sure whether I was an American soldier or whether I was the Vietnamese person being killed. I still didn't know what the larger story was, though. Then I went to high school. I went to an all-white, mostly white, very elite boys' prep school in San Jose, and there were a handful of us who were students of Asian descent. And every day at noon for lunch, we would gather in a corner of the school, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. Now, there was a story there too, but again, we didn't know what it was. What was happening, as I look back on these times, is that we were living someone else's story. Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese, America's war in Vietnam, the Asian invasion. These are all very powerful stories, but they were not made for people like us, Vietnamese and Asians. They were stories about us versus them. And in this story, Americans were us, and people like me were them, even if we were American residents, even if we were American citizens. And the reason why these stories were so painful or just problematic, even for someone like me at that time who didn't really understand them, was because I knew that I was one of them and not one of us. And that these stories were designed to stop people who were among the us, to stop them from caring for them. And so, at a very early age, I had this sense that stories were important and that we needed to change the stories that stopped us from caring. So how do we do that? How do we change stories of us versus them, of Americans versus non-Americans, of those who are remembered versus those who are erased or forgotten? I think the first step is to recognize how natural it is to fall into that story of us versus them. It feels natural for many of us to remember people who are on our side and who look like us. And for those of us who are not included in that story, it's very natural to want to be inside, to want to go from being outsiders in that story to being insiders in that story. We want to be let in, whether it's the high school clique or the American nation. And in our case, as Vietnamese refugees, my brother, me, and my parents, the answer to the problem of that story was very clear. How do we address the problem of us versus them? By proving that we are one of the American people, by proving that we are part of the American dream. And that's what my brother did. Came here at 10 years old, didn't speak English. 7 years later, valedictorian of his high school, on his way to Harvard. My parents, they had come from peasant background in Vietnam. They became successful merchants completely on their own. They lost almost everything in the Vietnam War. They came to the United States and they rebuilt their property and became so successful at what they did in downtown San Jose that City Hall forced them to sell their property because San Jose did eventually get redeveloped because of Silicon Valley, and the city thought, wow, we'd really love to build a new city hall right across the street from my parents' store. And so they bought my parents' store and turned it into a parking lot. That's the American dream. So we became a part of the American dream, and that's what happened to so many Vietnamese refugees. That's our reputation today, that we're not actually refugees anymore. We have become immigrants. And that distinction is so crucial, because even if at this period in American history, we're at a time when many Americans are feeling a little hesitant around immigrants, nevertheless, immigrants are part of the American mythology, and refugees are not. And one of the ways for refugees to become insiders is to become immigrants instead, because immigrants affirm the American mythology. Even for those Americans who don't like immigrants, they still like the idea that immigrants want to come to this country because it proves how great America is. So that's the story of the American dream. It's the easiest way for outsiders and immigrants to become insiders in this country. But in my case, I wanted to make that story more complicated. As a writer, as a teacher, as a scholar, I feel that part of the challenge that I have to rise up to is to talk not just about the American dream, but about the American nightmare as well. Now, this is a hard task. It's sometimes a potentially dangerous task. When Black Lives Matter's activists raise that issue of police violence and assert that Black lives indeed matter, they're challenging the American dream. And the reaction is oftentimes, as you've seen, very negative. When NFL players take a knee during the national anthem, they're also challenging the American dream and arguing that there's something else happening at the same time. To disturb the American dream, or to disturb any country's story about itself, is a hard and a potentially dangerous task, because there are many people in any given country, not just the United States, who want to believe only the best about their country. But every country is actually built from contradiction. Every country has the best and the worst. And in my case, as a refugee, the American dream asks of me that I affirm how grateful I am to be here in the United States. And that is the place of Vietnamese refugees in this country. A war was fought in our country. The United States came and saved us and gave us the opportunity to do things like my parents did and build a grocery store. But at the same time, I can't help but wonder would we have needed American aid if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place? Now that's a hard question to ask because many Americans don't want to hear that question. They don't want to hear the possibility that the United States invaded another country because the United States is built on this idea that we've only gone overseas to help people. And that's the narrative of the Vietnam War for the United States. Yes, things may have gone wrong during the Vietnam War, but it's not because America invaded Vietnam. It's because we just made some mistakes. And so in my novel, The Sympathizer, I set out to tell that story of perhaps we wouldn't have needed American aid if it hadn't been for an American invasion. And I was very careful in that novel because I knew this story would offend many Americans. So I was very careful in that novel to offend everybody else as well. Okay? So if you read the novel, you'll see that it offends the South Vietnamese people, it offends the North Vietnamese, it offends capitalists, it offends communists, but somehow there's a certain portion of the American population who read this book and who can only see that I've challenged the American dream and have written me hate mail saying things like, go back to Vietnam, love it or leave it. And that's what happens when you challenge a story that people hold so dear. They don't want to hear the challenge, and instead they want you to shut up. And our task, I think, as students, as teachers, as concerned citizens, is not simply to accept a dominant story, but to challenge it, to think about how that story might be flawed or inadequate. And if that story is flawed or inadequate, it's not enough for us to want to just be a part of it. It's up to us to change that story as well. So now, another dominant story that we have today that's challenging for many of us is Make America Great Again. This is a story that's very persuasive for a lot of people in this country. And it's persuasive because it is a way of saying we have an American dream. But what it says a little bit differently is that we had an American dream, but we've lost it. America was great, and it can be great again. For me, it's hard to hear this story, though, without hearing the echo of another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. Because I think if the slogan or the story, Make America Great Again, had existed in 1979 or 1980, whoever wrote that sign would have written or would have supported Make America Great Again as well. Because as a Vietnamese refugee, seeing that sign, another American driven out of business, and hearing Make America Great Again, I can't help but feel that it's because of the presence of people like me and my parents and Vietnamese refugees that America is actually not great. If we were not here complicating the American story, America would be great again. If African American activists weren't challenging the American story, we would be great again. But when I hear another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese, or when I look back upon that from my perspective today, I hear also another American driven out of business by the Japanese, because that was what was being said in the 1980s, or another American driven out of business by the Chinese, which was what was being said in the 1880s and what's being said today. So for some of us, Make America Great Again is hard to accept, because first of all, we have to accept that America was great in the first place. And for those who are persuaded by the story, Make America Great Again, they're persuaded because for them, America was great. But there are some people in this country for whom America has not yet been great. So, when I say that there's not simply the American dream, but the American nightmare, it's a direct challenge to this idea that America has always been great for everybody. But to raise that challenge is, for some people, to address a zero-sum game, as if America has always been great, and if you dare to question it, it means you're threatening their identity, you're threatening their investments in this country. And I think about how, in addition to Make America Great Again, there was another story that our president, Donald Trump, was telling when he made his inauguration speech. He said, "You will never be forgotten again. It was an important part of his speech. And what he was saying is that there are some people in this country who feel that they have been erased from the American story and that they have been forgotten. But it's not America's minorities that he was addressing. It was America's white people. And I thought that was very interesting because what he was doing in that story was taking up the rhetoric of other minority populations. Because oftentimes when we hear this phrase, always remember or never forget, it's said by minority populations who are asserting that we should not forget what was done to them in the course of history. And so when the American president says, you should never be forgotten to another population, and some of us feel hesitant about that, what that should make us feel is that this rhetoric of us versus them, which has been directed against us, can also be turned around as well. So the problem here is not simply to imagine ourselves among those who are forgotten, which is how minorities in this country have often experienced themselves. And now white people in this country are experiencing themselves as well. Because if we only focus on how we are forgotten or how we are erased, all that we're doing is caring about ourselves and others like us. I think our greater challenge is not simply to remember us, or not simply to remember how it is that we have been forgotten, or not simply to care about people who are like us. Our greater challenge is to remember others, those who are not like us. We must do more than imagine in this scenario how they are like us. We have to imagine how we are like them. And that's a very difficult task for many of us to do. I think the key words here are sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is pity, feeling for other people. And in that situation, when we see pictures, for example, of refugees who are on these small boats in the middle of the Mediterranean Ocean or the South China Sea and they're desperate, we may feel sympathy for them, pity for them. We, in an attempt to humanize them, think they are just like us and therefore we should help them. And that's a very important emotion. But another equally important emotion is empathy. That's when we identify as someone else, when we feel as someone else. And in that case, we are imagining that we are like other people. And sympathy and empathy are absolutely important to the act of storytelling. Whether you are a storyteller like me, who writes books, or you are a storyteller within your own community and your families, or whether you are a storyteller like President Obama or President Trump, we engage all the time in these processes of sympathy and empathy. But when the president says, you will never be forgotten again, he is engaging in sympathy and empathy, but he's narrowing that circle of sympathy and empathy to a particular subset of the American population. And he's diminishing America by doing so. He's making us a smaller country, both in size and in ambition. And what I am suggesting is that to make America great, what we need to do is use sympathy and empathy not just to care for others who are just like us, but in caring for others who are not like us, to expand the American story in both scope and complexity. When we expand the American story in scope, we make it ever more inclusive. We acknowledge that there are always more and other identities that we have yet to grapple with. For example, in my generation, trans identity was not even thought of, was not even imagined. At 18 years old, I was just trying to grapple with gay and homosexual identities and populations. But now we have new challenges, new assertions, new demands for recognition, and we should listen to those demands for recognition. In expanding the American story in its scope, we're also expanding the American story in its complexity, so that the American story is not only about the American dream, but it's also about the American nightmare. It's about recognizing that we are a complex and contradictory country that has made wonderful things possible, and yet which are built on difficult histories that we have to talk about ranging from genocide to slavery to appropriation of lands, exploitation of labor, the suppression of women's rights to vote, and so on. All of these things are what make us American, not just the good things. And so it's a story about not just us versus them, but a story about all of us that we need to engage with when we think about caring for others and not just caring for our own. And I'm going to end with a final note about what college has to do with all of this. Because for me, when I went to college at UC Berkeley, it was a very transformative experience for me. Because I went in and I came out learning not just about me, but about people who were not like me. So, before I went to college, the only stories I had about what it meant to be Asian in this country could be summarized in the Asian invasion. We were here just to take over the United States, to take away people's jobs, to take over people's cultures. But when I went to college, I took Asian American Studies courses. I learned about things like the 1790 Naturalization Act, in which citizenship was restricted simply to free white persons, a law that would have huge ramifications on America for centuries to come. I learned about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the very first time in history that the United States passed racially discriminatory legislation against immigrants, preventing almost all Chinese immigrants from coming to this country. I learned that the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the predecessor to ICE, was created not to deal with Mexican immigration, but with Chinese immigration. I learned about the Philippine-American War, the colonization of the Philippines by the United States from 1898 to 1946, including a war to conquer the Philippines that cost up to 1 million Filipino lives, a history that almost no Americans know anything about. I learned about the concentration camps of the 1940s, and by that I don't mean the concentration camps in Europe, I mean the concentration camps in the United States. They were called that by Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the Japanese before we realized that concentration camps were being used for some other purpose in Europe. I learned about the Korean War of the 1950s, in which 2 million Koreans lost their lives and 55,000 Americans. I learned about the war in Vietnam, which was also the war in Laos and Cambodia, which cost 3 million Vietnamese lives and 3 million Laotian and Cambodian lives as well. And what I learned from all of that was that many of us who are Asian are here in this country because of a very complicated American history of fighting wars overseas that have brought Filipinos and Koreans and Laotians and Vietnamese and Cambodians and many others to this country. And what I also learned was that I was not simply Vietnamese. I was also Asian American as well. And that was caring for people who were not like me. Because in Asia, people don't think of themselves as Asian. There, the Japanese hate the Chinese, and the Chinese hate the Japanese, and so on. But here in the United States, we as individual Asian populations have come to think of ourselves as Asian Americans as we care for others. But I didn't think of myself only as an Asian American. In fact, my first ethnic studies class at UC Riverside was Introduction to Chicano Studies. It was there that I learned about the Mexican-American War, the Chicano movement, the birth of La Raza, and all of that was very important to me because when I grew up in San Jose on South 10th Street in downtown, my neighborhood was white working class people, Vietnamese refugees, and Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. And I grew up among these others, and I learned more about them when I was in college. And I became a writer partially through reading writers who were like me, like Maxine on Kingston and John Okada and Carlos Bulosan, but also in reading African American writers, Frederick Douglass, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison. All of these were African American writers, but also American writers who have taken it to the very core of their being that there's not simply just an American dream, but an American nightmare at the same time. And it was through reading their books, which were rigorous and challenging and exciting, that I thought that I could write not just Asian American literature, but also American literature, that the experiences of Vietnamese and Asian Americans could be as universal as the experiences of African Americans, which are as universal as the experiences of white Americans in this country. And what college taught me, lastly, was that storytelling, what I've been spending all this time talking to you about, is what we need, but it's not enough. Now, storytelling expands our empathy, expands our community, expands our imagination. But we also need movements to enact these stories, just as movements need our stories to imagine a whole new future, a whole new set of possibilities. And that was why when I was at Berkeley, I was not just learning all of these histories that I've just talked to you about. I was not just trying to become a writer. I was also an activist, being involved in movements on campus. Because I had learned that my own existence as an Asian American, as someone aspiring to be an Asian American writer, wouldn't have been possible without the sacrifices of all these generations of activists before me who had created something called Asian America. And I think back to how there were writers of Asian descent writing in English in the United States beginning in the 1890s who must have felt awfully alone because there was no such thing as an Asian American. And they were writing for 100 years, and they were alone because there was no such thing as an Asian American. But their stories helped to create the foundation of an Asian American movement in the 1960s, and that Asian American movement helped to transform American life so that when I became a writer, no one questioned what Asian American writing was. So I was able to accomplish something on my own, yes, as a writer, but I was only able to accomplish something on my own because I was a part of a lineage of solidarity and community. And so what I learned from all that was that it was through working with others in these movements to build community and solidarity that I also learned to care for others as well. Thank you.
Thank you for coming today and presenting your information in front of us. I really do appreciate it. I found it very insightful. One of the questions that, by the way, I wanted to ask you, have you seen Ken Burns' 10-part series of Vietnam?
Yeah, and I've gotten that question many, many times. And, you know, sometimes I get tired of being a professional Vietnamese. You know, it's part of my identity. It's like I've written a lot about the Vietnam War and about Vietnam, and I bring it upon myself. But in this case, you know, I've actually met Lynn Novick, the co-producer. You know, we met a few times, and I saw about 45 minutes of clips in their production studio in New York City, and the clips were, you know, visually amazing.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I don't have 18 hours to watch the documentary, so no, I haven't seen the whole thing
Well,
yet.
it was just released, and it was just on TV. I'm sure they're showing it again, and I was mesmerized by it. Just a little bit of background. My father served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. I served 8 years in the Marine Corps. I have a very good friend of mine who was Vietnamese. And once we became very close, he told me a story very similar to yours. His father was part of the Ravens that fought for South Vietnam. And when the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong came over and they basically took over South Vietnam, they shot and killed his father right in front of him. So his mother and his younger brother were able to escape. But I have to take a little bit of issue with one of the things that you said. Well, a couple things. First, you said America invaded Vietnam. That's not accurate. And I look and I see all these young faces here, and I see these young people. And as an American, that bothers me. And I'll tell you why. America was invited to Vietnam from the South Vietnamese government. You know that, and I know that. So when South Vietnam invited America to come and protect them from the communist North Vietnamese, they did not invade. So by you saying things like that to these young people, they walk out here thinking they're invaders and their country was invaders. I don't think that's appropriate, and it affects your credibility. The second thing I'd like to say, you said we put people in concentration camps. I didn't come here to speak about this, by the way. I came here because I read about your story and I thought this is very compelling and it's interesting to me. But your lecture today was completely off of what it was put. Secondarily, you said that we put Japanese Americans in concentration camps. They were internment camps. Was it right? Absolutely not. What did the Nazis do in concentration camps? They slaughtered 6 million Jews. Did we slaughter any Japanese Americans?
Do you have a question?
Excuse me, I'm not done, sir.
You haven't said anything but talk. Do you have a question?
I'd be happy to respond to your points.
Yeah.
I know they're not questions, but I know the question that you're asking.
So
can I respond to your points?
My point is, you say all these things in front of these young minds. These are young people. They don't know. They depend on you as a professor to accurately portray what happened in history.
I thought his portrayal, I'm a historian, I think his portrayal was pretty good.
You know what? I don't want to listen to you because your facts aren't right.
Well, actually, I was just
I wanted to get up and walk out of here, but I wanted to hear what you had to say because I gave you an opportunity. I'd like you to talk about...
I actually am going to respond to what you said, actually.
So go ahead and respond whether or not America invaded and whether or not we had a concentration camp and killed people.
And as a matter of fact, the response that you gave...
before you begin, I want to be very clear that we are a community that really respects respectability and civility. And I want to be very clear about that at the University of Laverne. And so part of what you need to understand with respect to the Q&A is to respect the space. You have every right for your personal opinions. I'd like for you to respond, Viet, particularly because these points were directed at you, and then Al, if we could take your questions.
No, and I think I actually appreciate the response because it illustrates what I just said in my talk, which is that if you contradict the things that many Americans hold dear to their hearts about, I'm going to get to your point in just a moment. If you contradict what some Americans think of as fact, then their response is a completely negative response. And I'll tell you what are the facts. I said that Franklin Delano Roosevelt called these camps concentration camps. I'm not making that up. You can actually go and find this information on, let me finish. You said what you had to say. You said what you had to say. He did call them concentration camps. That is a fact. And they would have been completely acceptable to keep on calling them concentration camps until we discovered that the Nazis were also calling their camps concentration camps, okay? So that is a fact of American life that at least needs to be spoken about, that the rhetoric is very important. Only called internment camps after concentration camps were no longer politically acceptable. Invasion, it depends. Yes, the South Vietnamese government invited the United States, although invited is an oversimplification, okay? Because the United States installed their own president, Ngo Dinh Diem, that's a fact. The United States refused to adhere to the terms of the 1954 agreement, that's a fact. Even conservative historians would not dispute that, okay? So from the perspective of at least half of the country, northern Vietnam, the United States did invade. That's a fact. This is what makes it history, that you believe that the United States was invited, and a lot of these people in this room believe that as well. The South Vietnamese community in the United States would agree with this gentleman that the United States did not invade Vietnam, and I would never dispute that. But I'm still talking, sir. But a lot of the people in Vietnam do think the Americans did invade Vietnam. And lastly, I'm not concerned about whether or not you're going to be brainwashed by me. Do you know why? Because all you got to do is turn on the TV and you'll hear or watch an American movie about the Vietnam War and you'll hear exactly what this gentleman is saying. The entirety of American culture around the Vietnam War, including the Ken Burns Lynn Novick documentary, is geared to demonstrate that the United States went to Vietnam in order to help the South Vietnamese people, and they made mistakes, but they didn't invade. So me, by saying this in this room, is not going to persuade anybody in this room who isn't already ready to be persuaded. Because for the most part, Americans would already refuse to believe that anybody in Vietnam thought there was an invasion taking place. And these young people, or even older folks in this room, most of their exposure to the history of the Vietnam War is not from any kind of Vietnamese perspective, whether it's northern or southern, or communist or anti-communist. It's the American perspective. So I think you should rest assured that the American perspective is still dominant. Because wherever I go in this world, let me tell you, wherever I go in this world, and I tell people I'm researching the Vietnam War, and I bring up Apocalypse Now, for example, everybody has seen this movie, including the people who were opposed to the United States and the Vietnam War. So there's no shortage of the dominance of American opinion. So you shouldn't be worried that what I'm saying is somehow more powerful or more influential than what everybody in this room has already been exposed to. I said worried. I said worried. I didn't say threatened. I said worried. And we've given you enough time, so we'll take another question. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question about your short stories. The stories that you included in the Refugees have a long range from leaving Vietnam to people living here today. I'm wondering how you chose those stories that you actually used, because I'm sure you left some out. How do you go about doing or approaching a series of short stories about a question such as refugees?
I used an Excel sheet. I mean, seriously, I was like, okay, I wrote a story about, a man. Now I got to write a story about a woman. I wrote a story about someone who's straight, and I got to write a story about someone who's gay. Literally, that's what I did, because, I think that, again, for those of us who are minorities in this country, or any country, of course, we are tempted to represent our population, our community, where we came from. And we're responding to a majority that doesn't know anything about us, and tends to think that any minority population is homogenous. Well, their Vietnamese are all like this, or their Mexicans are all like that. But anybody from any given community knows that this community, even if it's a minority community, is incredibly diverse, right? Diverse in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of ideology, religions, and so on. And that's one of the things I wanted to demonstrate with the refugees, that even if I'm talking about Vietnamese people, they're really, really different from each other. And I just heard so many stories about different experiences when I was growing up, and in the research that I did, that I wanted to incorporate some of those diverse experiences into the book. Thanks.
Well, I was a foster parent of the URMs in the 80s and adopted Cambodian children who were refugee immigrants. And your story, BlackEyed Woman, was their story in many ways. And so for you to talk about story worked for me on two levels. It gave me another view of the heroine's experience that was at time during most of my years of parenting these youngsters was incredibly hard to get, because it was so painful. And it was painful for them to tell, and it was painful for us to hear. But I love your idea of challenging the existing stories. We can agree or disagree, but that you challenge using story, I think, is so powerful. And a third thing that really struck me, in BlackEyed Woman, you speak, I had to keep figuring out who you as the writer were, because it takes the story of the woman so wonderfully. It's an incredible short story. Thank you. How did you do that?
Well, thank you so much, yeah. Well, as I said, the basic tools of a writer, emotional tools of a writer, are empathy and sympathy. You have to imagine other people, even people who are like you. I mean, even if I were to write a story about my mother or father, I still have to imagine their experiences. And that was likewise for that story. But it's not an easy task. That story was the hardest story for me to write. It took me 17 years and 50 drafts to write that story. But hopefully it wasn't so hard to read it. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, congratulations on the Pulitzer. My family was also refugees. We came over in the early 1980s as boat people, as we were labeled. So my question is, you made a very clear distinction between being a refugee versus an immigrant. I was wondering if there's an event, a narrative out there that makes you making sure that those two words are not synonymous in a way, and that there is one that rolls into another. Refugee then become an immigrant, as you have spoke to earlier. Because when I was growing up in the United States, not too similar to your experience, but very close in being the minority and wanting to fit in and seeing an outsider, I didn't understand what that means to be a refugee versus an immigrant. I always thought that in Vietnam, when we were trying to escape, that was our choice to escape, from my perspective as a 2-year-old when all this went down, the fall of Saigon and whatnot. And so I thought it was my parents' choice to leave the country, so that I thought at that point to understand the word immigrant, that's why we were immigrants, versus being forced to leave our country for whatever circumstances and be labeled or take the label of a refugee. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I've met a lot of refugees who don't call themselves refugees, including Vietnamese people and other refugees. And they've told me, or they've said, we didn't want to call ourselves refugees because the perception of refugees was so negative. And so I think that exists out there, right? When we say the word refugees, I think for many people, again, their association is with these images that are very famous. And if we're speaking just about the Vietnamese people, it's of course the so-called boat people, overloaded barges, desperate people, this kind of thing. So we associate refugees with being unwanted, with being desperate, with near death, with being very pathetic. Immigrants, on the other hand, are a part of at least the American mythology, maybe not so much the European one, but the American mythology. And we heroicize immigrants, right? Even if periodically we might be against immigrants, still we think immigrants are a part of what makes this country great. They come here, they work hard, they sacrifice, and so on. And immigrants are desirable, at least the ones that we invite to come in, because they continue to revitalize this country. So it's a very easy thing for people who are classified as refugees to slip into being immigrants because it's just more acceptable. I mean, if you go, for example, to a cocktail party or dinner party and people ask you about your background and you say, I'm an immigrant, people are like, cool, where are you from? You say, I'm a refugee. People are like, oh, well, what happened to you? So it's two very different kinds of conversations that will ensue whether you call yourself a refugee or an immigrant. So in my case, I am, by any definition of the word, a refugee. And by definition, I mean, it gets really tricky, because the United Nations classifies something like 66 million people right now as being stateless, but only 22 million or so as being refugees. So there's some kind of distinction that's being drawn there. So to become a refugee is to become a part of a category that's really politically loaded, right? Because being a refugee entails you to certain benefits that just being stateless or an immigrant doesn't. But outside of all of that, I assert being a refugee not simply because it's accurate, but because I want to remind people that my experience and who I am is that of a refugee. Partly to say, look, refugees are actually just people as well. And that there are in this room right now probably people who are refugees. They're not the people who looked as if they just got off a boat. They look just like you and me, but they become a part of this country. And it's our obligation for those of us who are refugees or have been refugees to say so. That's the very least kind of thing that we can do to remind other Americans that refugees can become Americans as well.
Hello. Okay. I want to thank you for coming, first of all, and speaking with us, and I would also like to thank the university for inviting you to come. I'm half Vietnamese, half Chinese myself, and the war affected both sides of my family. Is there any way I can lower this, or is it just one size fits all? Okay. I've been overwhelmed with the commitment that the university has shown in telling the story of the Vietnam War through photo exhibits, through lectures, through plays, through art. And I remember the moment when I found out that you, a Vietnamese person, won the Pulitzer. It meant a lot to me, and I was like, Mom, we finally won something, right? So I've just been overwhelmed and emotional that the university has been committed to taking on this story that isn't the reason why I'm here and why I exist, but is one of the reasons why I'm here. The university is made up of about 4% Asian Americans, and so even less than that is of Vietnamese descent. And so I never imagined that I would learn about this in my classes, because I went to public school, and the narratives that I learned were of the Chinese Exclusion Act, were of Japanese internment, were of Chinese railroad workers, and it was about the Vietnam War as well. And so as I'm coming into my Asian American identity, as I'm learning more about myself and my people, my question really is, for you, I have two. Given the narratives, the negative narratives that we usually hear about Asian Americans, it seems to me that we are savages fighting in the jungle until we come to the US and exchange our power for citizenship. And we're seen as kind of powerless, because not many people know about the Asian American movement. And we don't have like a monolithic public figure like Martin Luther King Jr., like Cesar Chavez. So my first question is, can you think of maybe a number of figures or one figure that you think can symbolize the Asian American community? And my second question is, we just got a mural on campus, and it's brought up a lot of discussions about what our next one would be. And I was talking to the director for this Center of Multicultural Services, and he said, when we think of the word heroes, we think of figures like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, so on and so forth, but for a lot of people, when they think of heroes, they think of their parents or their family members. And I wonder if you also have a personal hero in your life that you look to and identify with. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that it's true. We don't have one of these iconic figures that everybody knows, right, and reveres and all of that. But Asian American history has had no shortage of people who have tried their best to mobilize their communities, to organize their communities, to work for civil rights, for solidarities, and so on and so forth. I'll just give you one example, someone who was influential on me, and that was Carlos Bulosan, who is a well-known Filipino writer who wrote America's in the Heart in 1946. And before then, he had been a labor activist, and he had come from the Philippines. He had experienced American colonization, and he had come, obviously, as someone who thought of America as a great country, and then gotten here in the 1930s and realized that Filipinos were only being brought over to serve as really subjugated labor in California and West Coast fields and so on. And he became radicalized, and he became a writer. And for a brief moment in the 1940s, as the United States was fighting World War II and confronting the fact that it was hard to fight for freedom overseas when domestically America was still enacting all kinds of racist policies at all kinds of different populations, Bulosan enjoyed a surge in popularity and could publish America's in the Heart. Well, he was a leftist and a radical. So then 8 years later, times changed, and all of a sudden he was being surveyed by the FBI, and he died an alcoholic and of tuberculosis on the steps of Seattle City Hall. But he had spent his entire life, being an activist, an Asian American organizer, a Filipino organizer, and being a writer who wrote one of the central books of Asian American literary history. And as for me, when you bring up the question of heroes, I think of the fact, going back to the boat people and the refugee example, I think one of the reasons why a lot of Vietnamese, for example, don't want to be associated with being a refugee, and a lot of people don't want to be associated with being a refugee, is that people don't think of refugees as heroes. They think of refugees as desperate people who would do anything to escape and who just need people to help them. But the fact of the matter is, the refugees already helped themselves by getting on that damn boat and leaving the country. And many of those refugees got on that boat knowing that their odds of survival were 50%. That's one of the figures that's put out there about how many people died trying to flee across the South China Sea, or if you think about how many people have died trying to cross the Mediterranean today. I don't think that that is the behavior of people who can only be called desperate. Yes, they're desperate, but they're also heroic. I mean, their chances of survival are actually less than the chances that the astronauts had. And we call the astronauts heroes. Well, for many of us who are the descendants of refugees, we think of our parents as heroes. My mother and my father, they are never going to be called heroes anywhere because they just live normal lives. But in the course of their normal lives, they fled twice as refugees. They lost everything and they rebuilt their lives twice as refugees. And the experiences of my parents are not unique. When you grow up as a refugee, one of the things you realize is that all the other refugees like you have had experiences like you. So when you're at that dinner party and you say, I'm a refugee, and other people who are not refugees look at you really strangely, like they don't understand, I'm reluctant to tell my story, not because I don't want to educate other Americans, but because I think we're actually lucky. Because in my family, despite all that we lost and all that we went through and everything, no one got killed. And most Vietnamese people I know, somebody got killed in their family, in the war or afterwards and so on. And these experiences were normal. So the heroic qualities of being a South Vietnamese person fleeing the war are evident to all of us who are of that community, but they're not evident to the rest of the American population, who again only get to see the Vietnam War from the perspective of Americans, where the American soldiers are the heroes, which they very well might have been, but the Vietnamese were the heroes in their own experiences as well. And you and me, it's up, even more so for you, I've had my chance, it's up to the newer generation to keep on telling these stories in their own different ways.
So first of all, I'd like to say that your story was very beautifully written. Reading through this, it's almost like you can attach yourself to each character, each situation, even if you've never experienced anything quite like it. It's the whole basis of just empathy and being able to sympathize with each story. And so I'd like to ask, would you be able to relate to a specific character or just in general all of them?
That's a hard one, I think. I think probably BlackEyed Woman, even though the narrator of that story is nobody like me, I think because I made her a writer, because I wanted to think about what that experience was like. What is it like to write a story? And writing a story, most of the time, is an incredibly painful experience. Sometimes we get lucky and the story just comes right out of us, which is what happened to me with The Sympathizer. But that's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Most of the time, as writers, we struggle constantly with all kinds of questions and doubts and things like that, and with the responsibility of trying to tell a story that will do justice to the subject that we're talking about. And that's what that story is about. She is literally, as that writer is literally trying to do justice to the experiences of her brother, the ghost, who died under terrible circumstances and has been forgotten. And that's an injustice. And that's the one thing that all of us who tell stories, I think, are trying to do, whether we're professional writers or whether we're storytellers within our own families, for example. We're trying to do justice to the past, to the forgotten. If your parents are telling you a story about their own experiences or the experiences of their ancestors or their communities, they're trying to do justice. They're trying to make sure that we or you don't forget what has happened, because forgetting is a kind of injustice, because forgetting means that we stop caring, right? And the act of writing, the act of storytelling, the act of listening to people's stories is in its own small way an act of justice. Thanks.
Hi. Well, I'm a Euro-American. And I did appreciate your story, The Refugees, because it gave me insight into something that I had not really thought about. But I have sort of a personal question for you. You talk about sympathy and empathy. Now, you came over here as a Vietnamese. You were perceived as an enemy of the Americans when you came over here, I presume. And you spoke no English. And now here you and your brother are graduates of Harvard and Berkeley, and your parents very successful, and you've sort of done all this with many, many handicaps. Is it possible that you have just the slightest degree of contempt for people who were born in America and who were born speaking English and whose achievements were not even close to what you and your family, and I imagine many of your friends were? That is my question.
No, I don't. I hope not. I think that's why when I listed the things at the beginning of the talk about people and populations we should care about, I said the white working class. That's been a subject of our debates about politics recently. And I'm a firm believer that, justice in this country is not just about race. And justice in this country is not just about class or inequality. Justice in this country is about all those things wrapped together. And so when I bring up my brother and myself and my parents as examples of American success stories, I hope that I did so ironically, because what I was trying to say is that our success stories shouldn't be taken simply as evidence that the American dream always works, because the American dream doesn't always work, and not just for immigrants or refugees or people of color or other minorities, but the American dream often doesn't work for white people as well. All of our fates are bound together. That's what the project of sympathy, empathy, justice, caring for others is about. It's to try to demonstrate that we are part of one community and our fates are tied together. So if we resort to the story of us versus them, people of color on one side, white people on the other, for example, it's a story that's doomed to fail. Because the successes of some people in this country are tied structurally to limiting the opportunities for other people in this country. And I'm of the firm belief, that if we wanted to actually achieve a more just American society, one thing that we have to do is to get white working class people to recognize that their fates are tied to the fates of black people in this country too. It's not us versus them. It's if you could elevate the conditions of black people and white working class people at the same time, they should be together in solidarity. But there are some people in this country who want to drive a wedge between them. And our project as teachers, students, and storytellers to build this more expansive, complicated American community of mutual caring is to try to persuade people to see that all these fates are tied together. And so my brother and I think we're both very aware of the privileges and the luck that we've had, both due to American policy, to fate, to my parents, and we're very aware that our stories are often used to obscure how difficult it is oftentimes to be successful in American society. Right? So in other words, I don't stand before you saying, hey, we're American success stories, everything's cool. I'm saying, hey, yes, we're American success stories, but it's because of this very complicated history that brought us here, that had a war occur in Vietnam, and then gave Vietnamese refugees opportunities in the United States, partly to demonstrate that the American dream has operated. But it's the task of all of us who have been successful because of our own hard work, but also because of the luck and the benefits that we've received through history, through fate, through structure, to try to change the conditions that opportunity is available for everybody. So no contempt on my part.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to address the concern, because it really irked me, the concern about how you might negatively or just influence us. But I feel like as college students and young adults, we can formulate our own ideas. Okay, so I would like to say that even though your book is based on Vietnamese people and refugees, the themes of the book pertains to Western and Eastern culture and how they collide. And I felt like your book pertained, like I'm not Vietnamese, I'm full Chinese, but even though it was about Vietnamese people and about the Vietnamese culture, it still pertained to me. Like, I paralleled some of the stories to myself, and I felt like that was very touching because on your preface, you put "for all refugees everywhere," and I felt like that was such a strong, like, it wasn't just solely refugees, but for people who can relate. Or I don't know, that was how I perceived it. What was your meaning behind your preface? Because there is this recurring, well, in my opinion, there is this recurring theme of ghosts in each chapter and how like people could fall into being a ghost, but they chose not to. So my question is, what was your meaning behind "for all refugees everywhere"?
You know, I think that when you're a writer, you are oftentimes confronted with this question of humanity and universality. Is your work universal? Is it really about the human, for example? Because, you know, you think, well, all the great writers wrote about humanity and universality, Shakespeare, Faulkner, Hemingway, everything, and so on. But the reality of it is that in order to grapple with humanity, and in order to write about universal experiences, we don't write in the abstract. We write about very specific populations, you know. And it's from the specificity that we derive what's universal and what's human. Because the reality of it is that we all share some very basic emotional experiences, even if our lives are different. So it was my conviction that, you know, it would be completely possible to write about refugees and to derive from that a set of experiences that people who are not refugees could identify with or empathize with. Because I have to do that all the time. You know, I'm not some white divorced person stricken with cancer living in Connecticut, but I'm periodically asked to read books about that, and I don't mind. Because that is a human and a universal experience, you know. I'm not undocumented, but I can read books about that because I can identify what's human in that, and so on. So I hope that's why you felt a resonance, not just because you were Asian or of some other kind of specific ethnographic identity, but because you could see what was of human value in these kinds of stories. And that's why it was important for me to include stories that were not about Vietnamese people in the book. You know, there's a story about an African-American bomber pilot. There's a story about a Latino man who gets a transplant from someone who he thinks is Vietnamese who turns out to be Chinese. And it was partly to demonstrate that Vietnamese people have lives that bring them into interaction with non-Vietnamese people. But it was also to demonstrate that the experiences that these non-Vietnamese people undergo aren't that different from Vietnamese people's experiences as well. That the Vietnamese people are actual refugees, but other people are spiritual refugees. They're homeless, even if they haven't been physically displaced. And that's what the title of The Refugees refers to.
Hello. So my question for you today is, there was a part in your book that I really resonated with, and it was really thought-provoking, and it seems to me at least, that it's kind of a recurring theme throughout your entire story, or all the stories I should say, and the line goes, "It was at this moment that I realized some people are haunted by the dead while others are haunted by the living." And I was just curious from your perspective, since you were the one that wrote that, what does that mean to you? Because I know what I could interpret that as, I know what my classes interpreted that as. So out of curiosity, what does the idea that some people are haunted by the living while others are haunted by the dead mean to you specifically?
What did your class come up with? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, on the face of it, we kind of decided that some people are haunted by the memories of the dead, those people that they connected with, that were in their lives at one point or another. And we also kind of decided that being haunted by the living is kind of representative of, like, even people that are not refugees, people that go through their day-to-day lives. It's things that you can never forget. Things that, like, for example, a person. That's a haunted memory of someone that is living because you may have had an experience with that person that can never be forgotten.
Well, I think that's right. Your class is very good. And specifically in that story, the woman of whom the narrator is thinking that of this particular woman, Mrs. Hua, and the reason why he thinks it in that way, I think, is because Mrs. Hua is haunted by people who are definitely dead, but people who she insists are still alive, even though we as readers think those people are probably dead. It was something that had personal meaning for me because I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that when we left Vietnam, we left my adopted sister behind, who was 16 years old. And I had no memory of her. Okay, but when I was growing up, we had one picture of her, a small black and white photograph of her when she was 16. And I knew that there was somebody missing in our family. And I didn't know why. Couldn't really ask my parents about it, it was just a very difficult topic to bring up and, beyond my linguistic ability. But I grew up feeling that there was an absence in our family, an absent presence. And that's what a ghost is in some ways. Something that's not there, but that's there at the same time. So she wasn't dead, but I was still haunted by her. I was haunted by how inarticulate her presence was, or her present absence was in our lives. And to me, that for me as a young person who didn't know how to make sense of my own history and what brought me to this country and so on, that to me symbolized what it meant to be haunted by the past that was still present, to be haunted by someone who is not there but who is not dead, to be haunted by the living. Thank you all for coming and for spending time here today.